Welcome to a world where living means surviving. Today, we are going on a journey through the most terrible, dirty, dangerous, and inhumane corners of the Middle Ages. This is a place where there was no hope, no hygiene, no chance to live to old age, where life was worth less than a piece of bread. Death lurked around every corner. Here you will not find knights in shining varieties or lavish feasts, only hunger, disease, wealth, and despair. Are you ready to see my side of the story, which is usually not shown in fairy tales? Then onward to the deepest places to live in the Middle Ages. In one of the remote marshy regions of Northern Europe, there existed a settlement that for many reasons could be considered one of the worst places to live during the Middle Ages. Located in a low-lying area constantly flooded by rain and river surges, the land was heavy, sticky, and unsuitable for proper agriculture. Endless dampness permeated the walls of huts, clothing, food, and people's bodies, causing illness and a constant sense of gloom. The waters that flooded the surroundings not only hindered farming, but also made movement a torment. There were no roads, only paths submerged knee-deep in mud. Even carts often got stuck in the mire, and neither horses nor oxen could pull them out without the help of several people. Any journey became a trial, especially in spring and autumn. The climate was cold and unpredictable. Spring could begin with frost, shift to downpours, and suddenly freeze again. In winter, temperatures dropped sharply, and the lack of nearby forests made firewood a luxury. People were forced to burn manure or rags just to maintain some heat. However, the smoke from this poor quality fuel filled the houses, causing coughing and eye irritation. Drinking water was also a serious issue. The swamps and stagnant pools were teeming with parasites and infections. Digging wells was difficult due to the high groundwater level, and those who managed to build them often found the water quickly contaminated. Dysentery, cholera, and other intestinal diseases were common, taking many lives, especially among children. The local diet was extremely poor. Grains grew poorly in the wet soil. Harvests were often lost to mold or eaten by rodents. Vegetables were scarce and fruit was virtually non-existent. The diet consisted mainly of porridge made from rotting barley, a bit of turnip, and marsh game such as frogs or ducks if they could be caught. Fish was sometimes consumed, but it too was often contaminated. A lack of vitamins led to scurvy, tooth loss, and general weakness. The local fauna added no comfort. Mosquitoes, midges, and other insects covered every living thing. Their bites caused itching, inflammation, and sometimes blood infections. Additionally, the marshlands were home to various predators, wolves, wild boars that were difficult to control. They attacked livestock and occasionally people. Education was virtually non-existent in this area. Due to its remoteness and poverty, neither monks nor traveling teachers came here. People lived without knowing how to read or write, passing down fragmented knowledge orally. The absence of written records or schools meant even the local church was nearly abandoned. Faith was expressed through superstition, fear of swamp spirits, and attempts to appease unknown forces. Law and order were weak. Being far from feudal power centers, the settlement was rarely visited by lords' representatives. Sometimes tax collectors appeared, but more often the area was plagued by bandits, marauders, and deserters. Vigilante justice, blood feuds, and fear formed the basis of social life. People built their homes closely together to form defensive circles, but this offered little protection during raids. Healthcare was limited to the use of herbs, often poisonous or ineffective. Healers lacking any knowledge of anatomy or medicine treated illness through trial and error, more often causing death than cure. Visits from real doctors were impossible. Even periodic epidemics couldn't be contained here. The disease simply wiped out everyone it reached. The social structure was extremely archaic. People lived under a semi-feudal system, but due to their poverty, they were of no interest to either lords or the crown. Power rested with elders, whose wisdom was based not on knowledge, but on age and the ability to intimidate. Decisions were made slowly, often irrationally, and rarely brought relief. Life in this place was an endless cycle of suffering. Isolation, disease, hunger, violence, and fear made this settlement one of the most inhospitable corners of medieval Europe. And yet, people continued to live there, not because they wanted to, but because they knew no other way. Far to the east, beyond the rocky highlands and deep forests, there existed a remote mining village perched along the edge of a treacherous mountain range. Its survival depended entirely on the extraction of lead, silver, and copper from narrow, unstable tunnels that pierced the earth like veins of darkness. The air at this altitude was thin, cold, and dry, offering little comfort to the lungs of the laborers who toiled there from dawn until dusk. The terrain itself posed continuous danger. Landslides and avalanches were frequent, especially during spring thaws or after heavy storms. Entire shelters could be crushed overnight beneath tons of rock and ice, leaving behind only shattered remains and the echo of past cries. Even walking from one part of the village to another required careful calculation, as one false step on an icy slope could mean a fatal fall. The quality of housing was deplorable. Built from whatever stone and timber could be carried up the slopes, the dwellings were cramped, dark, and poorly insulated. Winds howled constantly through the cracks in the walls, and snow often piled against the doors, trapping occupants inside for days. Heating was a daily struggle. Wood was scarce, and coal was dangerous to burn indoors due to poor ventilation, which often led to poisoning. Mining life was brutally unforgiving. The tools were primitive, mostly pickaxes, hammers, and buckets. Protective equipment did not exist. Miners worked by candlelight or oil lamps, and the fumes from both sources mingled with dust, creating a thick haze in the narrow tunnels. Explosions, collapses, and gas inhalation were common causes of death. Many who survived long enough suffered from blindness, chronic lung disease, or crushed limbs. Food supplies were meager. The cold climate did not permit farming, and trade routes were long and hazardous. Most of what arrived was stale, dried, or salted beyond recognition. Bread was tough, meat was rare, and vegetables were a luxury. Malnutrition led to widespread scurvy and other deficiencies. The people grew thin and tired, their energy drained by both hunger and constant exertion. Water sources were another major issue. Melted snow was often the only option, but it had to be boiled to remove impurities. And even then it tasted of minerals and ash. In dry months, water was rationed and shared among many, leading to unsanitary conditions. Skin diseases, infections, and lice were rampant. Bathing was almost unheard of, both for lack of water and for fear of cold-induced illness. There was no education or organized religion. The mountain was too distant for priests or monks to visit regularly, and few inhabitants could read. Stories passed down orally became distorted superstitions, often involving the mountain itself, believed to be alive and vengeful. Rituals involving stones, fire, and silence were common, born out of desperation rather than faith. Social life consisted mainly of silent endurance. Neighbors rarely spoke, unless necessary, as talking drained energy. People aged quickly, with gray hair and stooped backs appearing in what should have been the prime of life. Children worked as soon as they could lift a tool, and most never reached adulthood. Grief became part of the routine, indistinguishable from any other chore. Disease spread quickly in such a closed environment. Wounds festered without proper care, and even minor infections could turn deadly. Rats and insects infested storerooms and sleeping quarters. Plague outbreaks, while less frequent at such high altitudes, were still possible and always devastating. There was no help to be sent for. The village existed beyond the concern of kings and nobles. Those who tried to leave the mountain faced a dangerous journey. Downhill trails were narrow, icy, and riddled with hidden traps left by falling debris. Wolves and bandits patrolled the forest below, and many who left were never seen again. As a result, most remained, bound to their stone prison by necessity and hopelessness. Living in the mining village meant embracing a slow, painful existence. The silence of the mountains was not peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, and filled with the weight of lives spent underground. It was a place where the body broke before the spirit could even hope to rise. And yet, despite all the suffering, a peculiar kind of endurance took root among the people. Their lives were short, often brutal, but they adapted in ways that defied explanation. Children were raised to expect hardship from birth. They learned to walk in mud, to sleep through storms, and to eat whatever could be found or scavenged. What others might see as misery, they came to accept as normal. Cultural traditions, though rudimentary, began to emerge. Stories told by the fire, when fires could be lit, spoke of ancient creatures lurking in the fog, of spirits bound to the swamp, and of long-lost ancestors who had once tamed the wilderness. These tales, part fear and part hope, helped forge a collective identity. People didn't speak of escaping, they spoke of surviving. That was the highest virtue. Over time, crude alliances formed between families, not out of friendship but mutual necessity. Skills were passed down. How to build a roof that wouldn't collapse under rain, how to find edible roots, how to spot signs of fever before it became fatal. The elders, once feared only for their authority, became reluctant pillars of knowledge. Their stories weren't always wise, but they were the only map the community had. Festivals were rare but strange and fiercely celebrated. Sometimes they involved lighting fires on the driest ground to chase away evil spirits, or tossing carved dolls into the swamp as offerings. There were no real saints here, but the people made their own, patrons of frogs, mold, and rain. The line between religion and folklore blurred completely. Still, no matter how hard they tried to build meaning into their world, the overwhelming forces of nature and neglect constantly threatened to erase them. Floods could wipe out entire sections of the village overnight. Plagues could return and kill half the population in weeks. A brutal winter could leave even the strongest begging for mercy. And yet, the village endured. Not because of strength, not because of faith, simply because in the end, people will cling to life with whatever strength they can muster, even in the muddiest, most forsaken corners of the earth. Survival was not glorious. It was silent, grim, and uncelebrated. But it was survival nonetheless. In the arid heartlands of the Iberian Peninsula, beyond the reach of rivers and shaded groves, there sprawled a dusty expanse where scattered desert settlements struggled to exist. The soil was parched, cracked, and largely infertile. Rainfall was rare and unpredictable. The sun, relentless and unyielding, baked the earth during the day and left it bone cold at night. It was a place defined by scarcity, of water, of food, of relief. The settlements were composed of mud brick huts, low and narrow, designed more for survival than comfort. Their walls crumbled with each dry wind, and roofs sagged under the weight of accumulated dust. With no forest nearby, timber was a luxury. Homes were built with straw and dried earth, requiring constant repairs. Sand and grit penetrated every surface, coating food, clothing, and skin. Agriculture was nearly impossible. The ground could not support grains or vegetables without irrigation, and irrigation was out of the question. Wells were deep and difficult to dig, and those who managed to reach groundwater found it brackish and barely potable. Livestock suffered from dehydration, and crop failure was the norm rather than the exception. Barley and beans, when they could be grown at all, were stunted and bitter. The local economy relied on barter, as coinage was rare and had little value in such a deprived place. People traded with neighboring villages, goat skins for millet, salt for dried figs, but every exchange carried the risk of traveling over open, exposed terrain under a sun that seemed to boil the air. Thieves and desperate wanderers often attacked travelers, not out of malice, but out of need. Heat exhaustion was an everyday occurrence. Children and elders frequently collapsed, and there was no knowledge of how to treat them beyond cold claws and prayer. Disease came not only from dehydration, but also from poor hygiene. Without fresh water, sanitation was minimal. Human waste was buried shallowly or dumped far from the village, but flies, animals, and wind quickly spread contamination. Education was non-existent. Most people could not write their own names. Oral traditions preserved fragments of history, but those too were fading. The concept of progress was foreign. Life revolved entirely around survival. Even religious figures were uncommon. Few priests ventured into these lands, and when they did, they rarely returned. As a result, spiritual life took strange, regional forms, symbolic gestures to the sun or the earth, born out of habit more than belief. Medical practices were rudimentary and often counterproductive. Burns from the sun were treated with ash or oil. Infections from insect bites and minor injuries were left to fester. Childbirth was especially perilous. Many women died during labor, and those who survived were often left weakened. There were no herbs or salves, no instruments or guidance. The few who knew any form of healing were considered mystics, feared as much as trusted. Social order was fragile. Families kept to themselves, fearing disputes that could escalate into blood feuds. Councils of elders existed in some settlements, but their authority was limited to settling land disputes or organizing water sharing. Justice was informal, often violent, and based on reputation rather than fairness. Accusations, even baseless ones, could lead to isolation or exile, a punishment nearly equal to death in such a harsh landscape. Dust storms frequently swept through the region, blinding and choking all who were caught in them. Roofs were torn off, supplies were buried, and visibility dropped to nothing. After a storm passed, entire weeks might be needed to uncover food stores or rescue half-buried animals. These storms carried illnesses too, as dust penetrated lungs and caused coughing, wheezing, and suffocation. No art, music, or literature emerged from this region. There was no time, energy, or inspiration for expression. Existence was too raw, too immediate. The only beauty found in the environment, distant rock formations or occasional flowering plants, was viewed as a distraction rather than a joy. Celebration was rare and brief, and even weddings or births were seen with cautious reserve, knowing the likelihood of tragedy was high. This desert region of the Middle Ages was more than a difficult place. It was an exhausting, draining arena of survival. Every moment demanded endurance, every breath was hard-won, and every hope was dulled by sand and silence. It was a place people did not choose, but rather inherited, endured, and passed down, like a sentence spoken by the land itself. Among the wind-beaten islands of the far North Atlantic, a cluster of rocky outposts lay scattered in harsh isolation. Life on these islands was marked by biting winds, violent storms, and near-constant cold. The terrain was jagged and unyielding, with little arable land and almost no shelter from the relentless elements. These islands were not places of community or growth. They were places of survival against nature's indifference. The soil was thin and acidic, offering no promise of agriculture. Attempts to grow crops often failed due to the salty air, harsh winds, and short growing season. What meager harvests existed, mostly seaweed, lichen, and stunted root vegetables, were hardly enough to sustain a population. Most food came from the sea, but fishing was treacherous. The waters were rough, the tides unpredictable, and boats easily shattered on submerged rocks. Shelter consisted of low stone huts, built partially underground to withstand the wind. These homes were damp, poorly lit, and always cold. Smoke from peat fires collected in the airless rooms, irritating eyes and lungs. Clothing was made from wool or animal hide, but it did little to protect from the deep chill that seemed to seep through everything. People slept in clusters to conserve warmth, but still woke with frost in their hair. Freshwater sources were limited. Rain collection was common but unreliable. Springs were few, and most were brackish or tainted by nearby animal waste. In dry seasons, people were forced to drink from shallow pools filled with algae and insects. Diarrheal diseases were widespread. The lack of sanitation only compounded the issue. Waste disposal was crude, and running water did not exist. The isolation of the islands was total. Trade ships rarely visited, and when they did, they brought high prices and low supplies. Iron tools were rare and treasured, often passed down through generations. Without access to craftsmen or merchants, every item had to be repaired endlessly. Cooking pots with cracks, fishing nets with holes, and broken plows were common sights. There were no markets, no variety, no surplus. Weather patterns were brutal. Gale force winds tore through the settlements, flipping carts, ripping apart roofs, and driving sea spray inland. Winters brought snow that buried paths, and storms that swallowed entire sections of shoreline. Summer was barely distinguishable from spring, still cold, still cloudy, with only brief moments of sun. Even livestock suffered. Sheep grew thin and weak, and poultry often froze in their coops. Spiritual life was minimal. There were no churches on most of the islands, and priests came only once a year, if at all. Without written texts or sermons, religion existed as a collection of rituals and superstitions, many borrowed from older pagan traditions. Islanders buried the dead in stone cairns, away from the waterline, believing spirits would otherwise drift back from the sea. There was no formal education. Children learned only what was necessary for survival: fishing, herding, mending, enduring. There was no literacy, no arithmetic beyond the counting of days and sheep. Storytelling existed, but even that was limited. Tales focused on shipwrecks, starvation, or warnings about the dangerous sea. Hopeful endings were rare. Disease struck with little resistance. Wounds became infected quickly, and without herbs or knowledge, fever spread unchecked. Respiratory illnesses were particularly common due to the smoke-filled homes and cold, damp air. Child mortality was high, elders were few. There were no remedies except isolation, and isolation often meant death. The social structure was based on necessity. Small groups of families banded together, each taking responsibility for tasks like fishing, drying meat, or repairing tools. Conflicts over resources were common, especially during lean winters. There were no formal leaders. Influence came from age and strength. Justice was swift, rough, and based on survival, not fairness. These islands represented the extreme edge of medieval existence, where people were not merely poor but wholly cut off, surrounded by water, battered by nature, and neglected by history. Their struggle was not just with hunger or cold, but with the knowledge that no help would ever come, no change would ever arrive. It was not a place for living, but for lasting, barely, and without joy. Deep in the marshlands of Central Europe lay a stretch of inhospitable wetlands where communities clung to existence amid constant moisture and decay. These swamps stretched for miles, filled with stagnant water, tangled roots, and an ever-present odor of rot. Living in the marshes meant enduring a landscape that was neither land nor water, a transitional zone where nothing stood firm and nothing stayed clean. Structures were built on wooden stilts or floating platforms made of bundled reeds and logs. These homes tilted over time, absorbing moisture until walls warped and roofs sagged. Mold grew on every surface: blankets, walls, tools. Firewood, never truly dry, produced thick, choking smoke. Soot collected inside homes, making everything grimy and damp. Even sleeping brought little comfort, with constant chill soaking into the bones. Movement through the marsh was difficult and dangerous. There were no roads, only narrow planks or shallow boats guided by long poles. Sinking was a real threat. Children and animals disappeared without warning into patches of soft mud or unseen pools. Boots became waterlogged, clothes stayed soaked, and nothing could be kept dry for long. The very ground resisted cooperation. Food sources were limited to what could be gathered or caught in the wet terrain. Frogs, eels, waterfowl, and coarse aquatic plants formed the bulk of the diet. Grain was a rarity and had to be imported, if at all. Hunting in the marshes was unpredictable. Larger game avoided the wetlands, and the smaller creatures that remained were often diseased. Meat was stringy, fish were full of parasites, and herbs struggled to grow in the acidic, boggy soil. Disease thrived in the marshlands. Malaria, though not fully understood at the time, was rampant. People suffered from recurring fevers, chills, and fatigue. Insects were everywhere: mosquitoes in swarms, lice in clothing, and flies on every uncovered surface. The combination of bites, infections, and waterborne illness made poor health a constant condition rather than an occasional threat. Clean drinking water was nearly impossible to obtain. Rainwater collection was unreliable, and boiling was not always practiced or even understood. People drank directly from the dark, algae-covered pools that surrounded their homes. This led to digestive problems, vomiting, and chronic dehydration. Even while surrounded by water, there was no escape from the contamination. Isolation plagued the marsh villages. Paths to the outside world were long and hazardous, often requiring travel by boat through winding, confusing channels. Flooding frequently destroyed the few landmarks that existed, leaving travelers lost and vulnerable. Trade was minimal, and when it occurred, it brought goods of questionable quality at high prices. News from the outside was rare and outdated. There were no schools, no scribes, and no records. Life was passed on through repetition and necessity. The marshes were forgotten by lords and clergy alike. There were no taxes because there was nothing to take, but there was also no protection, no soldiers, no healers, no justice. If a crime was committed, it was dealt with privately or not at all. Law meant little where no one enforced it. Fire was both a necessity and a danger. With everything wet, starting a fire took time, but once begun, fire spread unpredictably through reed homes and thatched roofs. Fires often jumped from one shelter to another across the narrow boardwalks. Entire sections of settlements were lost in minutes, with people fleeing into waist-deep muck carrying only what they could hold. Seasons brought little variation. Spring and fall blurred into one long period of rain and flooding. Summer brought swarms of insects and unbearable humidity. Winter, while briefly freezing the marsh, brought no relief. Just stiff limbs, dangerous ice, and the ever-present threat of isolation or starvation. The environment provided no mercy, and the people adapted by lowering their expectations, not improving their conditions. The marshlands were a place where humanity barely existed, and nature barely tolerated it. Life there was a continuous negotiation between drowning, disease, and despair. With no firm ground to stand on, literally or metaphorically, life in the swamps was as unstable as the water beneath every step. High in the remote interior of the Carpathian Mountains, tucked between cliffs and forests, lay scattered hamlets, barely visible beneath the shadow of steep peaks. These mountainous communities endured some of the most isolated and unforgiving living conditions in all of medieval Europe. Harsh winters, treacherous terrain, and thin resources made daily life slow, repetitive, and exhausting. The elevation brought cold, even during the summer months. Snowfall could begin as early as September and linger until May. Frost bit through every layer of clothing, and homes built from crude stone and poorly cut timber offered little protection. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, and chimneys often became clogged with ice. Smoke from the hearth filled rooms, causing persistent coughs and eye irritation. The mountains were not easily navigated. Trails were narrow, rocky, and prone to erosion. Slipping meant serious injury, and help was rarely available. Avalanches were common in winter and mudslides in spring. Donkeys and oxen could barely climb the slopes, which meant that supplies had to be carried by hand, strapped to backs, or dragged in crude sleds. Trade with the outside world was rare and dangerous. Soil quality was poor. Terraced farming offered minimal yields. The growing season was short, and only hardy crops such as rye, turnips, and cabbage could survive. Frost often destroyed young plants, and heavy rains washed away topsoil. There were no large fields, just thin patches of rocky earth that required constant weeding, fertilizing, and maintenance for only modest return. Malnutrition was widespread. Livestock raising was no easier. Wolves prowled the woods, taking sheep and goats at night. Snow made pasture access difficult, and fodder had to be gathered and stored for long months of indoor feeding. Sickness spread quickly among the animals, and when one died, it was a major loss. There were no veterinarians, and few villagers had the knowledge or means to treat illness in animals or people. Water came from mountain springs or melting snow. Though cleaner than in some lowland regions, the water was freezing, and collection meant hiking uphill in brutal conditions. Icy streams and rivers could only be crossed by slippery logs or hastily made bridges, both of which posed a constant risk. People slipped, drowned, or froze while attempting simple chores. Medical help was non-existent. When someone became ill, they stayed ill. Most people relied on mountain herbs, many of which were either ineffective or harmful. Ailments such as frostbite, broken bones, pneumonia, and infections went untreated. Once a person could no longer work, they were cared for as long as food allowed. After that, they were left to fate. Religion was basic and local. There were no monasteries nearby and few churches. Once a year, a traveling priest might arrive to conduct mass, baptisms, and weddings. The rest of the time, rituals were held by elders using weathered icons and simple chants. Crosses carved from wood or stone dotted the hillsides, placed where people had died from falls, animal attacks, or exposure. There were no schools. Children learned only what their parents knew: how to collect firewood, grow food in rocky soil, avoid wild animals, and survive the cold. There was no writing, no numbers, no maps. Information from the outside world was almost entirely absent. Seasons passed quietly, marked only by hardship and repetition. Trade was minimal. Occasionally, traders brave enough to cross the mountain passes brought salt, metal tools, or cloth. In return, they took goat hides, dried herbs, or rough wool. However, most mountain communities were too difficult to reach, and those who lived there adapted by making do with crude versions of everything. Tools were repaired until they broke beyond use. Clothes were patched until threadbare. Nothing was wasted. Social structures were rigid but practical. Older individuals held authority not because of wisdom, but because surviving to an older age was so rare that it seemed worthy of respect. Conflicts were settled through group consensus or quiet avoidance. Entertainment consisted of simple songs, wooden carvings, or quiet storytelling by the fire. The Carpathian mountain villages were places of unrelenting routine. The days were quiet, cold, and nearly identical. Time passed slowly. There was no expectation of change, no ambition, and no margin for error. The mountains provided both a barrier and a trap, beautiful from a distance, but cruel to those who called them home. Along the desolate fringes of northern Scandinavia, far beyond the reach of fertile fields or central trade routes, there existed a series of frozen coastal settlements perched precariously near the edge of the Arctic Circle. Life in these bleak outposts was defined by extreme cold, isolation, and constant uncertainty. The winters were endless, the summers dim, and the thin line between survival and death was drawn anew with each season. The ground remained frozen for most of the year. Only a few weeks in summer brought partial thaw, during which shallow-rooted plants struggled to emerge. Moss and hardy lichens clung to rocks, while edible flora was limited to bitter berries and tough root vegetables. No grain could grow. Attempts at farming were mostly symbolic gestures, small patches of soil dug with great effort and yielding almost nothing. Housing consisted of low, wooden cabins with thick turf roofs, half buried in the earth to conserve heat. Inside, it was dark, smoky, and crowded. Oil lamps provided weak light, and animal fat stank as it burned. With few windows and little fresh air, these homes were suffocating and unclean. People slept on hay, bundled in furs, sharing limited warmth in spaces designed more for containment than comfort. Fishing was the primary means of sustenance, but it came at great cost. The sea was rough, and ice flows drifted unpredictably. Boats were often capsized by sudden storms or crushed by shifting ice. Falling into the sea meant near certain death from hypothermia. Nets had to be constantly repaired, and fish migrated unpredictably. Starvation was always a looming threat, especially if the catch failed or boats were lost. Meat was rare. Reindeer and seals were hunted, but this required long, dangerous journeys across frozen landscapes. Hunters often failed to return. When they did, the meat had to be rationed strictly. Preservation was difficult without salt, and smoke-drying methods were time-consuming and imprecise. The constant cold meant bodies needed more food for warmth, but the food was never enough. Illness thrived in the darkness. Vitamin deficiencies, frostbite, and respiratory infections were constant. Wounds did not heal well in the cold and often turned septic. There were no herbal remedies and little understanding of medicine. The sick were isolated, wrapped in fur blankets, and left to recover or die. Burial was difficult. Digging in frozen ground took days, and often the dead were simply placed beneath cairns of stone. The darkness itself was a burden. In winter, the sun disappeared for weeks, even months. The absence of daylight weighed heavily on minds and spirits. Time blurred. People lost track of days. Mood disorders, although unnamed, were widespread, manifesting as silence, withdrawal, or aimless staring. Children were born into darkness and grew up rarely seeing the sun. Light was not a concept but a memory. There were no roads. Snow buried every trail, and reindeer sleds were the only form of transport. Travel was slow, and misdirection meant death. Blizzards erased all landmarks, and compasses were rare. Isolation was not just geographic, it was total. Most people never left their settlement and had no idea what lay beyond the snow-covered horizon. There were no books, no schools, and no churches. Oral tradition preserved simple myths and instructions for survival. Religion took on local forms, shaped by the environment, gods of ice, spirits of wind, omens, and animal tracks. Without outside contact, spiritual life grew insular, combining fear and ritual. No clergy arrived, no records were kept. The settlements had no formal leaders. Authority was given to the eldest or most skilled hunter. Disputes were rare, as cooperation was essential. Everyone contributed, and those who could not were fed only while food allowed. Mercy was dictated by necessity. Infants born in harsh winters often did not survive the first week. Recreation was minimal. Songs were hummed quietly to oneself. Children played with carved bones or pieces of driftwood. Laughter was subdued, and stories, when told, focused on survival, of storms braved, hunts endured, or winters that were worse. Hope was not part of the vocabulary. Existence was practical, measured in days survived and food preserved. The northern coast was not meant for habitation, yet people lived there, not because they chose to, but because they had nowhere else to go. Life was a cycle of cold, hunger, and fatigue. The land offered no kindness, and those who remained came to understand that to live in such a place was not to conquer it, but to be shaped by its silence. In the dense, unbroken forests of Eastern Europe, far from rivers, towns, or roads, stood hidden villages shrouded in shadow and silence. These woodland enclaves were surrounded on all sides by towering trees, thick undergrowth, and near-perpetual darkness. Fog settled low over the forest floor, and daylight filtered only faintly through layers of leaves and branches. The isolation was deep and suffocating, making life feel as though it were unfolding outside the rest of the world. The forest floor was uneven and wet. Moss covered every surface, and roots twisted through the soil like traps. Building homes was a challenge, as the ground shifted and flooded frequently. Structures made of timber leaned over time, rotting from beneath or collapsing during storms. Roofs weighed down by wet leaves and snow sagged and leaked. Mold thrived on every surface. Even tools rusted quickly in the damp air. Navigation through the woods was almost impossible. There were no roads, just narrow footpaths quickly swallowed by new growth. Wolves and bears roamed the underbrush. Travelers disappeared often, either lost or taken. Horses were nearly useless on the narrow trails, and carts could not pass through. Villagers rarely left, and outsiders rarely arrived. Agriculture was minimal. The forest canopy blocked sunlight, limiting what could grow. Some families cleared small patches of land through back-breaking labor, only to have their fields overrun by roots and weeds within months. Turnips, cabbage, and onions grew poorly. Crop failure was frequent. The diet depended largely on foraging, mushrooms, berries, and herbs, though even these were unreliable and seasonal. Hunting was dangerous. Boars and bears could turn on hunters, and injuries were often fatal. Snares were set for rabbits and squirrels, but these yielded little meat. Bird eggs were gathered when found, though many were rotten or infertile. Fish could be caught from murky ponds and sluggish streams, but they were small, bony, and tasted of mud. Salt was nearly non-existent, making preservation nearly impossible. Fresh water was gathered from springs or shallow wells, often contaminated with plant debris or decaying matter. Waterborne illness was common, and without firewood to spare, boiling was rare. Diarrhea, fever, and skin rashes were constant ailments. There were no herbalists or remedies beyond superstition. Sick people were given leaves, prayers, and silence. Lighting was primitive. Fires were carefully rationed, as dry wood was difficult to find in the moist forest. Resin-rich pine was treasured for its ability to ignite, but even that smoked thickly in the humid air. At night, homes became caves of darkness. Candles were rare, oil lamps sputtered and smoked. Most evenings were spent in near silence, interrupted only by animal calls or the cracking of branches. Religious life was fragmented. Churches were far away, inaccessible by foot. In their absence, villagers relied on forest rituals, burning offerings, whispering names, or leaving objects in hollow trees. These acts were born of fear, not doctrine. Without priests or scripture, belief turned into a mixture of pagan remnants and fearful habit. The forest was not seen as nature, it was seen as a living, watching thing. There were no books, no formal knowledge, no learning of any kind. Wisdom came from repetition and imitation. Children learned to cut wood, gather food, and avoid danger. No one kept records, and events were forgotten as quickly as they occurred. Entire generations lived and died without seeing a town, a coin, or a map. Social life was minimal. Families kept to themselves, speaking only when necessary. Disputes were settled privately or allowed to fester. Occasional gatherings were held in clearings, usually for harvest or survival decisions. But these were short and somber. Singing was quiet and slow. Dancing was rare. Joy was not something expected. These forest villages were places of gloom and endurance. The people there were not driven by hope or tradition, but by habit. Life unfolded in a rhythm that never changed. Gather, cook, repair, sleep. And while the trees outside grew tall and unbending, those within remained low to the earth, hunched beneath centuries of silence. At the edge of the Eurasian steppe, beyond where the fields gave way to barren plains, stretched a wide expanse of dry, wind-blown land that seemed designed to repel settlement. Here, in the vast flatlands where the wind howled endlessly and dust coated everything, scattered communities clung to the bare minimum of existence. There were no natural defenses, no forest for timber, and few sources of water. The horizon was always visible and always empty. The steppe offered little in the way of shelter. Houses were made from mud brick or turf, low to the ground to resist the unrelenting wind. Without stone or solid wood, buildings quickly eroded, their walls cracking from the sun during the day and crumbling under frost at night. Roofs sagged under the weight of dry thatch and dust. Windows, when present, were covered with animal skins to block the grit-filled air. Farming was barely possible. The soil was hard and dry, cracked like leather, and poorly suited to crops. Irrigation was impossible without rivers or lakes. People planted millet, barley, or beans where they could, but yields were meager. Droughts occurred regularly, sometimes lasting several years. Rain fell unpredictably and was often followed by dust storms that buried entire fields under layers of silt. Livestock was crucial to survival, but it was vulnerable. Herds of sheep or goats roamed the steppe, guarded constantly against predators and theft. Wolves were common, and human raiders were not rare. During droughts, grazing lands turned to dust, and animals starved. Milk turned sour in the heat, and meat, without salt, spoiled within days. Herding was a full-time task that required constant vigilance, yet offered few rewards. Food was monotonous and insufficient. People lived on boiled grains, weak broths, and dried root vegetables. When meat was available, it was stretched as far as possible, rendered into soup, preserved in ash, or dried under the sun. Fresh produce was almost unknown. Salt was rare and highly valued, often obtained only through dangerous trade routes. Malnutrition was widespread, especially in children. Water was a constant concern. Wells had to be dug deep into the brittle ground and often ran dry. Surface water evaporated quickly or became fouled by animals. People collected dew when they could, sometimes wringing it from cloth laid out overnight. Thirst was a daily threat. Stagnant water bred illness, and dysentery was common, particularly during the brief, warm seasons. The wind never stopped. It scoured the skin, dried the eyes, and filled every crevice with sand. It tore through clothing and rattled the walls of every home. Dust storms could rise in minutes, turning day to dusk. People wrapped their heads in cloth, not for tradition, but for survival. Breathing the dry, particle-laden air led to chronic coughing and lung conditions that worsened with age. Education did not exist. Children were expected to help with herding and maintenance as soon as they could walk. No one wrote, and few had ever seen a book. Oral history was reduced to practical instruction: how to repair a broken yoke, how to predict storms, how to slaughter a goat efficiently. There were no songs, no stories of faraway lands, only repetition of immediate concerns. Religion was practiced in a simplified, symbolic manner. A small altar might be kept in each home bearing dried herbs, bones, or bits of iron. Occasionally, a wandering monk or holy man passed through, but most left quickly, unwilling to endure the dust and scarcity. People prayed in silence, not for salvation, but for rain or the absence of wind. Community life was limited. Neighbors were scattered miles apart, and visits were rare. There were no gatherings, no festivals, no celebrations. Communication was mostly by signal fires or messengers on horseback. If a family was in trouble, help arrived, late if at all. Many simply vanished into the dust, their homes reclaimed by the plains, their names forgotten. Life on the steppe was a matter of endurance. It offered nothing freely and demanded everything. The emptiness of the land reflected in the eyes of its people, tired, dry, and fixed on the ground before them. The steppe did not kill quickly, but it drained slowly, and those who remained were shaped not by prosperity or culture, but by the necessity of not giving up. In the shadow of towering cliffs along the western coasts of the British Isles, small fishing hamlets struggled against the harsh sea and rugged landscape. These settlements were built on rocky shores where waves crashed relentlessly, and the weather was unforgiving. The sea was both a lifeline and a threat, a source of food and danger in equal measure. Houses were small and made of rough stone, patched with turf and driftwood. Roofs were low, steeply pitched to shed rain and wind, but still suffered leaks. Salt spray coated every surface, corroding tools and making clothing stiff. The interiors were cramped, dark, and smoky from peat fires that barely warmed the rooms. Dampness was constant, seeping into walls, floors, and bones. Farming was limited to small plots of poor soil, where hardy vegetables like kale and onions grew with difficulty. The rocky ground and cool climate prevented large-scale cultivation. Livestock, such as sheep and goats, grazed on sparse grass clinging to cliff edges. Winter storms often destroyed what little pasture existed, leaving animals thin and weak.